Somaliland is home to over 7 million people, spread across a territory roughly the size of England. However, despite its relatively small size, Somaliland's population is not evenly distributed. The vast majority of people live in the western and central regions, while the eastern part remains sparsely populated. So why don't more people live in Somaliland's east? As usual, the answer lies in a mix of geography, economics, and history. Somaliland is located in the Horn of Africa, bordered by the Gulf of Aden to the north. The country's geography is defined by a mix of coastal plains, plateaus, and mountains. The most significant feature is the Ogo Highlands, which run from the west to the central part of the country, separating the more fertile and temperate western regions from the drier eastern lands. While the Sheikh Mountains have great road infrastructure connecting Burao and Berbera, that's not the case for the Sanag region, where the highest peak in Somaliland, Shimbiris, is located, which stands at 2,416 meters, roughly the height of some of the tallest mountains in Scotland. In Sanayag's mountainous terrain, there's no road infrastructure, which makes harder to connect Erigavo, the regional capital of Sanayag, and the coastal towns of the region like Mate and Hace, and the wet highlands in between, which has the potential to become Somaliland's food basket. The further east you go in Somaliland, the more arid the landscape becomes. The Hod and Sul regions are covered in semi-desert and savanna with fewer permanent water sources. Rainfall is scarce, and what little precipitation does fall is highly seasonal, leading to frequent droughts. Unlike the west, where cities like Hargeisa, Berbera, Borama, and Burao have access to relatively better infrastructure and trade opportunities, the east remains largely undeveloped. Somaliland's rivers, known as tagas, are seasonal and rarely flow year-round. The longest, the Togd here, runs through the central regions and provides crucial water sources during the rainy season. However, in the east, water is even scarcer. Towns and villages must rely on deep wells and underground reservoirs, making large-scale agriculture nearly impossible. The arid conditions have shaped a predominantly nomadic way of life, where people move with their livestock in search of grazing land. Somaliland's geography plays a massive role in shaping its human settlement patterns, economy, and infrastructure. Despite being a relatively small country, the rugged, dry interior remains largely undeveloped, while the western regions have more concentrated populations. But geography isn't the only factor. History has played a major role as well. Somaliland's eastern regions have long been home to pastoralist communities. For centuries, these groups lived semi-nomadic lifestyles, moving across the region in search of pasture and water. The area was never heavily urbanized, unlike parts of the western Somaliland coast that were influenced by trade with Arabia and the wider Indian Ocean world. Historically, major settlements were concentrated in places like Zayla, Bulahar, Lugaya, and Berbera, which were part of powerful trading networks that connected East Africa to the Middle East and South Asia. During the colonial period, British Somaliland was established primarily as a protectorate rather than a colony, meaning its administration was minimal. The British focused on maintaining control over Berbera as a key port for trade and livestock exports, while the interior, especially the eastern regions, was largely left to traditional governance structures. When Somaliland gained independence in 1960 and later entered a failed union with Somalia, development remained focused on the west, particularly Hargeisa and Berbera. However, much of the reconstruction and investment has centered on the western and central regions, where the war with Somalia affected the most, and majority of the population lives today. Cities like Hargeisa and Berbera have experienced economic booms, benefiting from international trade, investment, and infrastructure projects. In contrast, the eastern regions, particularly Sul and Sanag, have remained underdeveloped and at times politically contested due to their proximity to the border with Somalia. Today, nearly 70% of Somaliland's population lives in urban centers, with Hargeisa and Burao alone accounting for over 3 million residents. Hargeisa with over 2 million residents, while Burao has over 1 million residents. The combination of better infrastructure, job opportunities, and access to services has drawn people westward. Meanwhile, the east remains dominated by pastoralism, with towns like Lasanod and Erigavo serving as the main urban centers. However, these areas lack the same level of development found in the West, leading to continued migration towards cities like Hargeisa, Burao, Borama, and Berbera. One of the biggest challenges facing eastern Somaliland is infrastructure. Roads connecting the east to the rest of the country are poorly maintained, and the lack of major transportation links makes it difficult to attract investment. The road between Burao and Arigavo, as well as the rest of the Sanag region, for example, is one of the most critical yet remains underdeveloped, limiting economic growth and access to services. In contrast, Western Somaliland has benefited from significant infrastructure projects, including the expansion of the Berbera port, which has boosted trade and employment. Security is another factor affecting settlement patterns. While Somaliland has been relatively peaceful, more developed compared to neighboring Somalia, the eastern regions have experienced occasional political tensions and disputes, conflicts and competing claims over certain areas by Somalia, and its militias have at times disrupted stability, discouraging long-term development projects. Natural disasters also play a significant role. Somaliland experiences periodic droughts, and the eastern regions are often hit the hardest. Severe droughts have led to large-scale displacement as pastoralists lose their livestock and are forced to migrate toward urban centers. Despite these challenges, efforts are being made to develop Somaliland's east. The government has initiated infrastructure projects aimed at improving road networks and access to clean water, but there's a high unemployment rate in the eastern regions. International organizations have also supported initiatives to improve education and healthcare in the region. However, the pace of development remains slow compared to the more economically vibrant West. Ultimately, Somaliland's population distribution is shaped by a combination of geography, history, infrastructure, and economic opportunities. While the West continues to grow and urbanize, the East remains sparsely populated due to its harsh environment and historical neglect. Whether future development efforts can change this remains to be seen. But for now, Somaliland's east remains one of the least developed and inhabited regions of the country.